Happy 4th of July and happy Independence Day. My name's Keanu Trujillo, the host and founder of the Building Belmont podcast. In today's episode, I want to start foundationally by saying this is not about a statue. Although we're covering the history and the story of the Spirit of the Fighting Yank statue, which you'll find in Stowe Park in downtown Belmont, it's more about what it signifies. It's more about the representation of hope and unity and freedom and opportunity that this statue since 1946 to today in 2022 has represented. And throughout its story, throughout its history, it's been a symbol and an opportunity to bring people together. And this statue has been the catalyst for that through several parts of its story that you're going to get to hear today. And even today on this platform, I hope that it is an opportunity for connection. We live in a time where almost every conversation, situation, every headline is divisive. But we live in the greatest country on earth, and I truly believe that, having served in the military, a lot of my family have served in the military, being a Hispanic and Native American man, my wife, her family immigrated here from Mexico legally. She's first generation American, and I still believe we live in the greatest country on earth for freedom, for hope, for opportunity. And although we have parts of our history that are shameful, that as a nation we regret, we still serve as a symbol, as a beacon of hope. And there are people that are literally dying to get into this country, to experience liberties and the freedom that we take for granted daily. So I hope that today, with this episode and it being Independence Day, the 4th of July, that you take an opportunity to reflect on the freedoms that we have as American citizens. We can't do much as a community to change the world at large or even change our nation at large. But as a community, we can come together in unity to serve and care for each other, to empathize with each other, to have conversations with each other, to not let the division of this world divide our community. As I mentioned, being Hispanic and Native American and my wife's family being from Mexico, we're not from here. We're from New Mexico. We moved here about 4 years ago, and we fell in love with this community and what it represents. And yes, there are parts of this history of this community that we'll get to cover on this platform, that we'll get to share in, that we're not proud of, but those also made us and brought us here today to have this community of connection that takes people in, that loves them well, and makes them want to stick around even though they may not be from here. This country and what we represent and what we provide is we're celebrating. So although we cover the history and the story of the Fighting Yank today, I hope you see this more as a symbol of unity and connectivity. So thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Building Belmont podcast, and I hope you enjoy the guests and the story that we capture today.
My name is Ron Foulk. I was a former council member and longtime resident of Belmont.
I'm Juan Logan. I moved back to Belmont, I guess in 2012 from Chapel Hill, and it's always been home for me. I'm a painter and sculptor and printmaker and all that.
An artist.
An artist.
True artist,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, tell me about the story of the Fighting Yank. Let's get into the history.
Okay, the history of it, at the end of World War II in 1946, the Junior Chamber of Commerce in Belmont decided that they wanted to have a fundraiser to raise money to put a statue at the high school. At that time, it was a brand new high school. So they conducted that fundraiser with children and various people in the community, raised the money, and they were a little bit short on the money, and some of the local mill companies helped them out with that. So they commissioned him to do the statue and to do the sculpture, and the sculpture was dedicated on November 1st, 1946. Where the statue was placed is it was at the high school, which was a relatively new building. It was a pretty big event. There was a lot of celebration, political speeches. The high school band played, and many of the town's people came to view the statue. There was a debate at times in front of City Hall. They were going to put it in like the square underneath the red light and have a little pedestal there, and some of the people felt like that somebody had run into it or something. There was some kind of, and then because the high school was brand new, then they felt like it would be more appropriate up there at the high school.
You mentioned that Duquesne created 5 of the Fighting Yank.
Right.
Where were they located?
All right, well, it was in Chicago, Illinois, Bloomington, Indiana, Port Huron, Michigan, Oil City, Pennsylvania, and Belmont, North Carolina.
Do you know if any of the other 4 are still standing?
I have no idea. I have no idea.
We might have to do a little research to find out if they are.
Yeah.
We might have the only one left.
Well, that's possible. Now the statue is, the context of the statue is a zinc with a copper coating.
The war was had ended. Metal, I doubt that they had the ability to cast it in bronze, nor could we afford that at the time. Zinc was inexpensive. Putting a copper coating on it meant that you could also put a patina on it, or it would patina in a very natural way, that greenish tone that copper and bronze always can get. And so it would look the way it was supposed to as time passed.
The name of it, the Fighting Yank, and the significance of exactly what it is, why it is. What can you share about that?
I think at the time, if you look at the Yank, it's a soldier holding a Tommy gun in one arm and a grenade in the other. So I think that what it tried to portray was the action of the soldiers in the war, of actually fighting, and that portrayal of it. So I think that's why.
Why was it important at that time to see that and to remember that? What was the mindset at the time?
I think the mindset back in that era, if you'll think about it, there was a lot of, patriotism, and the idea of telling, of recognizing the veterans, and the idea of patriotism in the America. I think that was very prevalent.
I think we go to our artistic counterpart, our artist, slash historian as well. The symbolism and the way that art is representative in the community, and how it draws that attention. What can you share about the importance of that, being able to see it, experience it in the community and the public?
Well, in that particular piece, it's really because patriotism was so important immediately following the war. We were really gung-ho in lots of ways, I suppose. But we wanted to pay homage to those soldiers that died in the war. And that was the best way of doing it. It really was. And two, so many things get pulled into this in terms of how we and why we document things this way. You have to realize that when we talk about U.S. monuments, and this isn't true of all countries, but it is true in America, think about the monuments that are generally created. They are of war. They significantly talk about, it's one of those things where we often create things that put us forward in a particular way. It talks about power, it talks about politics, it talks about our ability to control situations and all that. We were, in that war, the dominant culture, if you will, in terms of driving the war. And fighting in it, providing arms for it, and so on and so forth, and manpower. It's interesting that this is a French artist I'm referencing now, but he said that when we create monuments out of bronze, or concrete, or steel, 50 years after they're made, we often forget why we made them in the first place, in terms of the true meaning of those things. But if we create a monument that we have to rebuild on an ongoing basis, we would always remember why we were doing it. So when you look at the Vietnam Memorial, for example, it's rebuilt on a daily basis. Because people come in, they place their flowers there, their photographs there, and they will always remember why they're doing it. Until that generation and the next generations, moves on. And that's what monuments, I think, ultimately are supposed to be about. And when we create monuments of soldiers, when we create those kinds of monuments that display our power and our resolve in terms of fighting for freedom, it's a different kind of monument. There's nothing bad about it. It's always, generally speaking, it's a very, very good thing to do. But it's what we do.
Now we're rebuilding it in
Right.
a way, and so it's reminding us why.
We always want to pay homage to the commitment made, the service given, the lives lost. We always want to see what we can do in terms of documenting that. And generally speaking, it's an interesting thing too, because when we think about the young people of today, will they have the same feelings about that monument? Doubtful. About that war, unlikely. Because they have not been pulled into a similar situation yet. And unless they are, I think we oftentimes will always view those things quite differently in terms of younger generations. The older generations like us now, we'll always remember why.
Well, there's obviously, different narratives. Things like this can be unifying.
Of course.
Things like this can also be divisive. So that's where I'm really hoping in this conversation that we can see how this is a unifying.
It's definitely a unifying thing, because I think it speaks to the resolve of the entire town in terms of what we thought was really important and felt at the time, and still do feel that it's very, very important to pay homage to those soldiers. And it's not just the soldiers per se, it's also America and a way of life that we're paying homage to. This is something that we believe in terms of that fight for freedom. And it becomes, it's who we are, who we were in that moment.
You inspired me in saying that it's not just about the soldier. And when you said that, it made me think about all of those behind the soldier, that every piece of equipment, every weapon, every garb, it was all created
It's all part
elsewhere.
of it, right.
Then that led me to thinking about the artist again, back to our old friend McKesney, who here in America had the ability to express and be creative and create this art. We had that freedom. So this soldier that he's creating gave the freedom that he has to create the art, where we know that that's not the case in all cultures. So from an artist's perspective, how does that hit you differently?
Well, see, here's the thing I think that's ultimately important about that soldier. I mean, the best part of it all is that he doesn't really have a name. And because he doesn't, that makes him the most important soldier out there, because he represents all of us. Not Colonel George, not Colonel Smith, not the generals, but each and every one of us. And that's the most important part of it.
The Fighting Yank was later relocated to downtown Belmont. Here's why.
2011, on July the 24th or 25th, 3 individuals came to Belmont. 2 were from Ohio and 1 from Stanley. I don't know if that matters, but anyhow, individuals came to Belmont, and they pulled it off a pedestal. When it pulled off the pedestal, the head broke off of it. The head, I brought the head and showed you the head. They took the head, went over to Mahaui at Dutchman's Creek, where that bridge goes across there at Dutchman's Creek, threw it in the creek. All right, from July to February, the Belmont police investigated. On February the 9th, they caught one of the people, and of course they all turned, they told them, they said, well, where is it? They said, well, it's in Dutchman's Creek. So the Gastonia diving team went over to Dutchman's Creek, went in the creek and found it. And these individuals weren't children. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. And I don't know why they would pick it up and carry it to Mahaui. I guess they got worried about it. I don't know. That was in February, and there was a lot of talk about the patriotism part and a lot of interest in the community. So the divers from Gastonia, they volunteered. So they went over there and searched for it. And then after was the statue that was found, and it was sent, and I guess they pulled a mold or something of it. But that started the conversation. What is the Fighting Yank? And the great thing that started the conversation was as much as the people who were against moving it as the people who wanted to move it. And that started the conversation. And then, we started the cycle of raising money, and several people donated their skills. We had some engineers that donated their time to do some drawings. We had McMillan Crane Service who did it, Yank Monument Company. There were a lot of people who donated their skills. So in excess of the $85,000, you had a lot of skills that were donated and that kind of thing. And when the statue was moved, this is the problem. There was a committee who was responsible for it. The city gave us permission. We had to go to the school board to ask them if they'd give it to us. They said they would. Then we went to the city council and wanted permission to move it down there, and it was a simple majority that told us we could. But it was on the committee to move it there. Juan was part of it. I don't know what would happen if we dropped it. Because we had, we had no insurance or anything, and everybody, we just assumed that he knew what he was doing, and the other people knew what they were doing,
Figure it out.
Yeah, so we moved the pedestal down there first, and then we went to move the statue. We found out that the bolts weren't lining up, remember? And we took it to Public Works and had some monument company came out and re-drilled and all that. So it was the great part of the project was a synergistic, synergy of the community, of cooperation of many, many people.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, it was
It's sort of representative of the soldier and the reason that it's there.
Yeah.
In terms of, it required all of us, in all of our involvements,
everyone had their talents.
That is it's a beautiful thread that's woven there.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean that. For the Belmont brand right now.
Yeah, I know. Hey, go ahead, put that right on in there.
I'm going to run with it.
There you go.
Right. And as it went on, even to the fact that it started to grow and grow and grow, and the detractors, started to get less and less and less. But at first, it was a very, you're either one side or the other.
Change is sometimes difficult for people.
It was.
And it's always interesting. We were doing a project in Wilson. We spent 7.5 years refurbishing 31 sculptures by Bala Simpson. And there were the naysayers in terms of moving it from his farm to a 2-acre park in downtown Wilson, and just didn't want it done, And when it was finally finished, they were the best people in the world. Yeah, so glad that it was there.
What changed their mind?
Seeing it actually take place. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that the thread that's being woven from 1946 to 2011 to 2022, the purpose of it was supposed to be unity and remembrance. And in 2011, what was accomplished was unity and remembrance.
Exactly.
In moving it and
Sure.
refurbishing it. And now again in 2022,
Yeah,
this podcast is unity and remembrance. And I think it's just interesting how even the methods from 1946 to 2011 to 2022 that were used to bring people together, although they change, it's still the principle of it.
Sure.
So that's the
the driving
that
force.
I really enjoy seeing there.
Yeah, see, actually that all started in 2011, culminated in 2014, and then when we had it down there and it was set, we thought we needed to have a celebration. So we have an individual on our committee that contacted then Governor McCrory, and we closed off Main Street, set up about 200 chairs. It was a community effort. We had the high school band down there. We had various politicians come and all that. It was a great celebration. A Pearl Harbor veteran who was a survivor of Pearl Harbor, and then we had a Korean War veteran to unveil the statue. It was a great celebration. And then 2014, we captured Juan because he come up there and helped us. I was trying to find people that I could blame if it didn't work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If we dropped it, I say, well, I'm sorry, Juan was responsible for the movement of it.
Was that when you were a city council member?
Yeah.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yes, sir.
But you're wrong.
You're right.
That won't make the
He's still doing that today.
I know, this is the
He
truth.
invited me to pick the
See?
colors and he's not responsible.
Yeah.
that is wisdom is what we call it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, but the ironic thing when it was moved and everything, the way we came with Terra Mare is I was down there one day and there was a crack in the back foot of it. I said, Juan, we need to fix it. So Juan came down there and fixed the crack. I handed him materials while he fixed it. I was his assistant. And then Juan looked at it. Then the discussion started again of, it's deteriorating a little bit, and Juan can speak to that. So here again, you had 3 occasions. The first occasion, more than the gun, the Thompson machine gun, the idea that we need to do something with it in conjunction with the American Legion, the idea that we had to go to the school board, they were willing to give it to us. The city council was willing for us to move it down there. And the site that we moved it on used to be an old gas station site. So the footing on that thing is probably 6 feet deep because the dirt wasn't good.
I know.
So we poured a lot of concrete. So then you had the interest of the community discussion of why you should, why you shouldn't. Then you had the celebration. Young people were brought in from the high school, so it started to bring that back to why it is and why it's there. And then this occasion here.
The idea of having it at all, if you're not going to take care of it, is sort of senseless. The time, the energy, the money involved in creating these things in the first place is excessive sometimes. I mean, it really is. It costs a lot to install these things. And then to have it and not take care of it. Nothing had been done to this piece in 80 years. which is sort of crazy in a way, So over the years, and being under the oak tree, copper layer is so thin, it's just a layer of copper, it's just a coating. But the zinc was pitting, it has a way of, because it's so thin, that hill that Ron is mentioning was falling out, it had deteriorated, water was dripping there. So it was, eventually the whole hill would have been lost, So things like that, I think it's important to save these monuments, to repair them, to conserve them on an ongoing basis. And it's no different than what we do with other things in the city, with infrastructure. If it breaks, we fix it, and we try to maintain them so that it won't break at all, so that we can always have use of it. And I think that's what it's all about, if we are going to have those things. And there's another monument in the cemetery that also needs to be conserved.
What is that monument?
It's made out of granite, I believe. And which
It's a World War I.
World War I. Okay.
World War I.
Yeah.
It's like an obelisk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, are you ready to move another statue? You're so good the first time.
He's really good with that. And this is kind of awful. When he got ready to move it, they ran into a problem because it was in cement, and they had to jackhammer it out. And then when they had to they had to separate it. There seemed to be issues all along the way, but for some reason, we were lucky to have good people that volunteered their time, and it worked out.
Well, and it sounds funny thinking about this piece, but I will say that on that Vala Simpson project, I think the tallest piece was about 60 feet, and about, I think, maybe 4 tons. So we can move big things. That's what I was telling Ron about this piece. Oh, we can move big things. That's no problem.
That is interesting.
Right.
What do you two hope people think or feel or believe when they see the Fighting Yank now?
Don't you think the issue you have now, if you're downtown, many people come up and stand in front of it, get their photograph taken, look at the little script out at the sidewalk, and I think what it does, like Juan said, it starts to say, even with young people, what was World War II? What was that all about? So I think the great thing is it starts a conversation, and I think we need to relive and understand and appreciate our history. And I think that's what it does. But a lot of times people with the prom will come there and get in front and take their photograph and go down to the fountain. Little children will come in there and look and start asking the question, what is that? And well, actually when they were working down there, many people came up to the folks from Terra Mare and asked them about the statue. So I think that the great thing, it starts a conversation. It started a conversation. I didn't know there was a statue or a thing in the cemetery of World War I. So it started that conversation. So I think that's the important part of it.
I think there's certainly that. There's no question about it. But also, it's sort of what I was saying earlier. It belongs to all of us. And I think it's a matter of ownership. And the fact that it looks really good right now, more people will see it because we are talking about it in a very, very different way than we ever have. And again, we will lay ownership to that. And that's the most important part.
As we make our way to the second part of this episode, I hope that you thoroughly enjoyed spending time with Juan and Ron and hearing their story, not only about their involvement with the Fighting Yank statue, but also their involvement in our community. There's so much that each of them have done to serve our community that we will be sure to have them on again in future episodes. In the next part of our episode, we catch up with Paul and Claudia from the Terra Mare Conservation Team. They travel the world not only engaging and helping to restore these statues or preserve these statues practically in their efforts, but also capturing and preserving their stories. So I hope that you have enjoyed this episode thus far and that you enjoy getting to know Paul and Claudia and their efforts with the Fighting Yank statue.
Hi, I'm Claudia Camello. I'm a conservator and principal of our company Terra Mare Conservation. Terra and Mare meaning land and sea. We conserve artifacts from different environments, wet and dry. So we wanted that to be reflected in our business name.
My name is Paul Mardikian. I'm originally from France. We've been working with Claudia for many years on a number of projects that are ranging from shipwrecks to amazing outdoor sculpture like this one, and many different countries.
We're based out of Charleston, South Carolina. When we're not working on site, that's where you'll find us.
Wow, so all over the world, and we just happen to have you it's a few hours away.
Yes.
Charleston, obviously it's very historical. There's probably a lot of work to do there, but I love history, so I love going to Charleston. Why did you base your operation in Charleston?
We love the city. Paul was already based there. I was not living there at the time, and we decided that would be a great base in the U.S. The Southwest and the Southeast. I would say the Southeast particularly. There's not a huge number of conservators, which is funny. There's a lot of people that do historic preservation on buildings and architectural, but it's a little bit different to what we do. We do more objects, three-dimensional artifacts. Sometimes they're attached to buildings, but we don't really do structural, buildings and architectural preservation. But we love the city, so it was a great choice.
Well, a conservator is going to look at not just the aesthetics of the object. You're not just restoring the object to make it look good. It has to be part of the work, but essentially you're looking at the object like a doctor is looking at you when you are sick. You need to look into what could affect the object in the long term. For instance, this particular sculpture has been damaged a number of times, and you've got structural cracks that had to be addressed. That's an example of what conservators do. It is not just to make the object look good, although it is part of it.
Yes. So it's not just appearance and cosmetic, it's also structural.
Right, absolutely.
So tell us
Yes.
about what we were able to do with the Fighting Yank up into this point. What did you find, and what did you help to conserve in the Fighting Yank?
I would say there were a number of issues that we had to start with, and Paul was just explaining how conservators look at the whole picture like you would look at a patient. They're our patients, so we want to understand what is wrong with them, what is the deterioration, and what are the steps to remediate that. So the first thing we look at is the structural. We were concerned because there were a number of cracks we saw during our assessment here back in, I think it was April. We were worried that may cause additional problems down the road, so we had to address those first. And then we started looking at the corrosion. There was a lot of corrosion on this sculpture, and that is normal for a metal placed in an outdoor environment. Whenever you place anything outdoors, you have a greater level of deterioration, and you need to do the maintenance. So we had to address the corrosion, and then we went to, as Paul was describing, the aesthetics, trying to integrate the color and the patina of this sculpture. It had other interventions on it. We didn't want to erase all of that. One of the things conservators do as well is think about the intangible history. There's tangible, which is the structural, and the materiality. But there's also a story to this sculpture, which is very important but we were concerned with that too. We wanted to honor the artist as much as we could and his intention in putting this sculpture here.
So there are a lot of factors that you're considering when you're conservating a sculpture. Tell us a little bit more about the process and how you do what you do.
It starts from really looking carefully. Conservators use a lot of empirical skills in their work. The way conservators are trained is they train in art history, chemistry, materials, deterioration, and also physical techniques of restoration. So those are the things we're bringing to this. We're bringing all of those empirical skills, but also we need to understand what the corrosion is, how we want to sort of stop that. So there's some chemistry there. We're using materials and techniques that we know will arrest that. And then we look at things like the long-term protection of the sculpture. So anything in the outdoors needs a coating. Different materials can be used. We decided for this to use an acrylic coating for many, many reasons. But so that's how we sort of go through that. It's a process, looking very carefully at the materials and then deciding on the techniques. And when we come here, we have an idea what we want to do, but sometimes we have to change based on what we find. And that's always interesting for us. There is an artistic side to it, particularly with the coloration of the sculpture, and that's something we asked Adrian to come down, and Juan Logan came down, and Ron came down, and we all stood around, and Jamie was there too, and we talked about how it should look, because it is in the public eye, and sculpture can be very contentious. So we do want to make sure that people understand why we did what we did, and why, the color is important. And this sculpture is made of zinc, which is a little known fact, but it has a copper plating on it, which we don't really understand why the artist did that. We think probably it was for reasons of economy. Zinc was a lot cheaper to cast. Copper and bronze is very expensive to cast, particularly in the 40s. So putting that copper plating on and then doing a patina that made it look like a bronze, we think was the artist's intent.
Yeah. And the other point is that working outdoors is very difficult because you have to deal with the humidity, you have to deal with the sunlight, you have to deal with all kinds of things that sometimes make your work more difficult. You're really weather dependent, so you have to adapt to a different environment for every project.
What's been the most well-known, maybe U.S. monument, but which one's the most well-known that listeners would say, oh, I know that, or I'm familiar with that?
The sculpture of Iwo Jima that's on Parris Island Marine Corps base. It is a little known sculpture. I mean, everyone knows the sculpture, the big bronze, but this was made of concrete, and it was made by the artist, the same artist that did the bronze, and this was like, it was made for the war bond drive, to drive literally on a giant semi-trailer around the United States to raise money for the war. And so this was also done in the 40s and put on the base around 1952. And that sculpture is exceptionally meaningful to the Marine Corps because it represents that moment in the history of the war, and it represents that photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal. And so for us, it was very meaningful to be asked to do the restoration of that sculpture. And because it's on a military base, we knew deeply that the sculpture really should now be moved indoors because it was extremely deteriorated. However,
made of concrete.
It was made of concrete. It was covered in numerous impermeable coatings. We had to do a lot of work on the interior of the sculpture to remediate the corroded rebar, which was inside the legs and all the arms. And we didn't want to move it because, as we were just talking about, the story behind that sculpture, that moment for the Marine Corps is very important. So the intangible story behind that was so important to them that they wanted to leave it on the parade ground where all the cadets and the graduates get their photographs taken. People leave dog tags on the sculpture. So we preserved that. We felt like the memory of that sculpture and the story was almost more important than the material of the sculpture. But we had to remediate the material because that was our project, but we also tried to encompass that story. That was really, I think, probably the most memorable.
But every project is absolutely different, and you get to meet new people. And we, as Claudia mentioned at the beginning, we work on different environments and particularly on shipwrecks. And we're just coming back from the shipwreck Clotilda in Mobile, Alabama, which is absolutely an amazing story. We've also conserved the engines from Apollo 11 that were recovered from the ocean and that are now on display at the Smithsonian. So we do those conservation missions, essentially, absolutely rich, technically, humanly. It's unbeatable. So this is why our job is absolutely amazing, and every time it's an incredible adventure.
So what have you come to learn about the Fighting Yank? What's been either most interesting to you or some of the story that you've captured thus far about this sculpture particularly?
I think it's a really good question because before we come on site for a project, we like to know the history behind the sculpture. Whether it's been treated previously is important for deciding on the conservation plan. And so we request records about that if there are any, and quite often there aren't any. So using all those skills I was describing before is how we put together our conservation plan, and then we have to sort of change a little bit when we come on site if we find things that are different. For this sculpture, I think we knew a little bit about the history that had been vandalized before, so that was meaningful to us because we knew that, for example, that there was a new head attached to the body. So the head is in much better condition because it's been outside less time. It's only been there since 2012. The sculpture has been there since around 1946. And so we were conscious of that. So the treatment plan for the head was slightly different. And I think one of the things we learned from Ron actually was that the plate on the inscription on the back of this sculpture, which is the artist's, we would call that the artist's mark. And so he has his name there and the year. And when he did that, and we learned that that was covered up at one point, which I think was really significant. The reason we know that is because there's people in this town of Belmont that know that. But also you could see a different level of corrosion because that had been covered. It was not as corroded as the surrounding area. We could tell that straight away without knowing the story, but knowing the story made it so much richer. And why that was the case, we're not completely sure.
It's a multi-layered history that you reveal, and conservators are going under the skin of the object, essentially. And they're able to see things that no one else can see. Sometimes small details, but we are essentially archaeological conservators. We work on archaeological sites, and therefore we work with the archaeologists, the curators, the historians to reveal the story. So the conservators' work is part of the narrative that feeds into the big story. And so we do not look at a sculpture differently than we would look at an object unearthed from, an archaeological site.
I was just going to add that's important because the way conservators are trained, we were trained in three-dimensional object conservation, but our skills cross different contexts and time periods. So this is a contemporary sculpture. I would call it a historic sculpture from the 1940s. Something more contemporary would be something, that might be cast now. But our skills also transfer to artifacts that are thousands of years old. Some of those artifacts have very similar problems to this sculpture. They've been in the wrong environment, they're corroded, they have levels of deterioration. So it's interesting to think like that because even though we have a deep background in archaeology, the skills are transferable to contemporary materials because it's all about materials in the environment for conservators. Those two things dictate the level of deterioration and the condition of your artifact, wherever it is.
And there is also a dimension in materials. It's very rare that you're only working on one material. Here on this sculpture in particular, you've got the zinc, you've got the copper plating, you've got different levels of patina that were applied over the years. So you really have a composite object. And we work on wood as well. We work on stone, ceramic, glass. It's all about the context and the level of alteration. So objects are not necessarily made of one material. They can be absolutely diverse, like we are.
And this is a little known fact about this sculpture. I think that it's zinc. Most people would say it's bronze or iron or something like that. So that's really a cool feature.
What is it that would happen if we didn't take efforts or invest in ensuring that we're doing what we're doing now, right, and bringing you in to do this? What would happen, and what's the importance of making sure that we do this?
It is really, really important. When you have any material in an outdoor environment, as we were discussing before, you will have deterioration. There is simply no avoiding that. And so the City of Belmont is doing the absolute right thing by doing this level of conservation and maintenance. We're also maintaining this sculpture. So looking at it periodically, taking photographs, washing it down, checking the coating, these are things that are going to keep this sculpture looking great in the long term. It's also important to look at it periodically so that you know if there's an issue. And if there is, because you can't avoid corrosion. We've arrested it for now, but eventually the coating will have to be reapplied. And so if you have your eyes on that artifact, you know the condition of it. You also know if any vandalism has happened or anything like that. There's some other issues going on with the base, because we also looked at the base of this sculpture and cleaned that. And there's some issues with the inscription that may have to be addressed down the road. But it's extremely important to do that maintenance. We would say, honestly, that's the most important thing, because by the time you call us to do the work, there's a problem. And so if you don't reach that level, if you keep up the maintenance, the sculpture will be beautiful for the next 100 years.
As we close, I leave you again with a happy 4th of July and happy Independence Day to you and your loved ones. I hope that you enjoyed getting to hear the story of the Fighting Yank statue, also getting to hear the story of the conservation efforts, the preservation efforts. And I hope that as you experience the Fighting Yank statue when you're downtown Belmont, sitting at Everyday Market having a coffee, or just driving through, maybe spending some time with your family at the park, that you're able to reflect on what it means, the history, and also how it serves as a beacon of hope and opportunity moving forward for our community to continue to unite, to continue to come together in service and love and connection with one another. Joining us for another episode of the Building Belmont podcast. I'm your host, Keanu Trujillo, reminding you to subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. And of course, share with a friend, share with a neighbor. We'll see you again next week as we capture more stories, create more connection, and share more information here on the Building Belmont podcast.